A black woman quietly stepped into the federal courthouse, ready to testify against a powerful corruption network, when suddenly 2 police officers appeared in front of her. Without cause, they accused her, cuffed her, and hauled her back to the precinct. They thought they had won, thought they had silenced her by locking her behind bars, but they were wrong. What they didn't know was that she wasn't just another woman. They had just arrested a federal security consultant with CIA clearance. Chicago was awake, but it hadn't stretched all the way out yet. The early morning light fought through the gray sky, bouncing off the glass and steel of a city that had long learned how to move fast but stay in place. The streets hummed with the rhythm of a new work week, horns blaring in frustration, feet pounding against sidewalks, voices sharp with caffeine-fueled urgency. The scent of fresh coffee and gasoline mixed in the air, painting a picture of controlled chaos, a routine dance of hustle and delay. Maya Bennett had no time for the dance. She stepped out of her sleek black Audi, the sound of her heels clicking against the concrete precise, measured, the sound of a woman who never second-guessed her place. She adjusted the strap of her leather briefcase, feeling its familiar weight against her palm. Inside, neatly arranged and secured, were documents that could alter the course of an ongoing federal investigation. Some men in expensive suits would kill to keep these papers buried. Some already had. And in her other hand, just a simple folder. Just a few pages, but worth more than the reputations, the careers, the lives of the men who had worked so hard to silence the truth. The Daniels Federal Courthouse loomed ahead, a gray monolith that promised justice but rarely delivered it. Maya knew the truth: justice didn't live here. It made guest appearances, usually in handcuffs. 5 more steps and she'd be inside, past the mobby, past the metal detectors, inside the very courtroom where her testimony was set to shake the ground beneath people who thought themselves untouchable. She was supposed to be leading this hearing. She was supposed to be the one asking the questions, demanding answers. And then it happened. "Hey, hands up." The voice was sharp, a command wrapped in assumption, in certainty, in the absolute belief that it never needed to explain itself. Maya stopped mid-step, her pulse steady, her face unreadable. Slowly she turned. 2 white officers, hands hovering just close enough to their holsters to make sure she noticed. Sergeant Vincent Hart and Officer Lucas Reed. She didn't need name tags to know their type. She had seen them before. Different faces, same playbook. Hart stepped forward, his stance rigid, his expression the kind that said he was used to being obeyed. His badge gleamed in the early light, pinned to his chest like a symbol of absolute authority. Maya put the bag down and stepped back. His voice was calm, but the tension in his body betrayed him. Maya tilted her head, amusement flickering in her dark eyes. Oh, this was about to be interesting. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice even measured, as if she hadn't just been ordered around like a criminal. "What's the issue?" Reed was already scanning her, his gaze flicking between her tailored navy suit, her polished heels, the briefcase in her hand, as if a black woman in professional attire carrying legal documents was an inherent threat. "You match the description of a suspect involved in fraudulent government activity," Hart said. Maya let the words settle, as if they were too ridiculous to acknowledge. Then, slowly, she exhaled a humorless laugh. "Fraudulent government activity," she repeated, letting the accusation hang in the air between them, heavy with irony. "Let me guess. Black woman, nice suit, carrying important-looking papers." She arched a brow. "Yeah, I hear that's real dangerous these days." Hart's jaw twitched. "Just cooperate, Mom." There it was, that tone. Not a request, a demand. Maya's eyes flickered to the courthouse doors. She was minutes away from walking into history, from exposing names that had stayed clean for far too long. Instead, she was here, being treated like a criminal for existing in the wrong skin. "I don't have time for this," she said, her voice still level, but laced with the kind of authority that made men nervous. "I work here." Hart didn't blink, didn't ask a single follow-up question. He didn't care, because black people explaining themselves to cops never actually mattered. He reached for his cuffs. "You resist its obstruction," Reed added. Maya's lips parted in something that might have been a smile, if it weren't so sharp. "Obstruction," she echoed, letting the word roll off her tongue like something amusing. "That's cute," her gaze locked onto Hart's. "And what exactly am I obstructing? The fresh air?" Hart's patience snapped. The cuffs were out, steel flashing in the weak morning light. Maya didn't flinch, didn't fight, didn't give them anything. She simply lifted her hands and let it happen. Because she wasn't just playing their game. She was about to flip the whole damn board. The ride to the precinct was silent, but it was the kind of silence that carried weight, thick and suffocating. Maya sat in the back of the squad car, her wrists bound in cold steel, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Outside, the city blurred past, unaware, unconcerned. Another black woman in handcuffs. Nothing new. Just another Monday in Chicago. Hart drove, fingers clenched around the wheel like he was strangling it, his jaw tight, his eyes locked forward. But his mind was already working, calculating, twisting, shaping a version of events that would make him untouchable. Beside him, Reed was quieter, but Maya could see the way his fingers twitched against his knee, the way he kept glancing at the rearview mirror, at her. He was younger, less sure, still waiting for Hart to tell him what to think. That was the thing about men like them. Hart was the hammer, Reed was the hand holding it. The squad car pulled into the precinct, the massive stone structure looming like a monument to every bad decision that had ever been given a badge. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, stale coffee, and something sour underneath, something institutional, something rotten. A place where too many had walked in, but not all had walked out the same. Hart yanked the door open. "Move," he ordered, stepping aside just enough for Maya to climb out. She stepped onto the pavement, her posture as poised as it had been outside the courthouse, as if she had walked in by choice, as if she hadn't just been illegally detained. It was an art, holding power even when they tried to strip it from you. The booking process was routine, mechanical. Her fingerprints were taken. Her belongings, her phone, her briefcase, the folder, confiscated, placed in a plastic bin like they were nothing more than trash. A female officer patted her down, her hands impersonal, bored, like Maya was just another body moving through the system. And then, finally, the cold, gray walls of a holding cell. The heavy metal door shut behind her with a finality that might have rattled someone else. Maya simply exhaled, controlled, measured, and sat down on the hard metal bench, folding her hands neatly in her lap. She had been in worse places. What mattered now was the waiting. Not waiting for freedom. Waiting for them to make their mistake. And they did. Right outside the cell, Hart and Reed talked. They thought they were being quiet, but quiet didn't exist in places like this. Sound carried. Words stretched through the cracks, found their way into ears that weren't meant to hear them. She had the documents on her, Reed muttered, his voice low but not low enough. Maya's fingers tightened slightly against her knee. Hart exhaled sharply. Doesn't matter. We say she tried to pass them off as real clearance files. A pause. Then a small, nervous shift. But what if they are real? Hart let out a short, humorless laugh. Then we say she stole them. Fraud, impersonating a federal officer. No one's going to ask questions. Another pause. Then the words that sealed it. She's a nobody, Reed. Judge will believe us. They always do. Nobody. Maya took a slow breath in through her nose. Let the weight of it settle. Not because she was scared. Not because she was angry. Because she was tired. Tired of the same old script. The same recycled lies. The same men who thought they could rewrite reality with nothing but a badge and enough arrogance to think the world would never question them. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She let them talk. Let them dig themselves deeper. Every smug assumption, every careless word, it was all evidence. They thought they had the upper hand, thought they could twist the story in their favor. But the truth had a way of crawling out from under the lies, sharp and unforgiving. And soon they'd feel the cut of it. The door to the holding area slammed open. Boom. Boom. Like thunder rolling in before a storm. And just like that, everything changed. The sound of the heavy metal door slamming open was enough to make the entire precinct pause. The air shifted, tension thickening in a way that was almost tangible. Hart and Reed turned, their postures stiffening instinctively, their hands twitching toward their belts like men who suddenly realized they might need an exit strategy. But there was no exit, not for them. Andre Lawson, Maya's lawyer, stood in the doorway, his broad frame cutting through the dim fluorescent light. a storm wrapped in navy blue wool. His suit was razor sharp, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression unreadable, but the weight of his presence filled the room like an incoming verdict. He didn't walk into spaces, he occupied them, took ownership of them, made them his. And right now, this precinct belonged to him. "She's coming with me." His voice was steady, deep, the kind of voice that wasn't used to repeating itself. Hart didn't move, but Maya saw the way his jaw tensed, the way his fingers flexed against his side. The arrogance was still there, but there was something underneath it now. A crack. A flicker of uncertainty. "She's facing serious charges," Hart said, his voice carefully controlled. Andre barely spared him a glance before dropping a thick file onto the desk between them, the sound sharp, deliberate. "No," he said, voice smooth, almost amused. "She's facing a serious lawsuit. You, on the other hand, are facing a federal investigation." Reed's fingers twitched. Hart's expression didn't change, but Maya saw it, that half-second of hesitation, that brief flicker of panic before he forced his mask of authority back into place. He picked up the file, flipping through it with the kind of confidence that suggested he still thought he could talk his way out of this. Andre let him. Let him skim past the formal legal letterhead. Let him absorb the words, unlawful detainment, abuse of power, obstruction of justice. Let him sit with the realization that this wasn't some routine arrest gone slightly off script. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Hart frowned, flipping to the next page. His grip on the file tightened slightly. "What is this?" Andre leaned in, just enough to make it feel personal, just enough to make Hart feel the shift in power. "That," he said, voice dropping lower, more deliberate, "is a federal complaint filed by the Department of Justice. Turns out my client isn't just some civilian you decided to harass. She's a government security consultant." He let that sink in for a second before adding. "And that fraudulent document you claim she had. It was scheduled to be entered as evidence in today's federal corruption hearing." Silence. Real, suffocating silence. Reed swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably, but Hart held on to his pride with white-knuckled desperation. He was still clinging to the belief that he could regain control of this narrative, still thinking he could maneuver his way out. "She didn't tell us that," he said, voice tight, defensive, reaching for the last scrap of plausible deniability. Maya finally spoke. Calm, controlled, deadly. "Oh, I didn't." Her tone was almost playful, her dark eyes locking onto Hart's with something that wasn't quite a smile. "Must have slipped my mind, since I was thrown in cuffs before I could even open my mouth." Hart's fingers curled into a fist. Reed wouldn't meet her gaze. "You think this is over?" Hart asked, voice low, almost a growl. Andre didn't blink. "Oh," he said, tilting his head slightly, "I think this is just getting started." And the worst part. Hart knew he was right. Hart's fingers twitched against the folder, but his grip stayed tight, like if he held on to it hard enough, it might somehow hold his crumbling reality together. The weight of the moment was settling in now, pressing down on his chest, wrapping around his lungs. He had been so sure. So damn sure. But certainty had a way of evaporating when faced with something bigger, something colder. And right now, Andre Lawson was the coldest thing in this room. The tension stretched, thick and unrelenting. Reed shifted beside Hart, his discomfort bleeding through the cracks of his carefully controlled demeanor. He was younger, less seasoned in this particular brand of damage control. His hands fidgeted against his belt, his knee bouncing ever so slightly. He wasn't built for this kind of pressure. He needed Hart to tell him what to do, but Hart had gone quiet. That was the problem with men like him. They thrived in control, in power, in the certainty that the system would always bend in their favor. But what happened when that certainty was ripped away? When the weight of their own arrogance came crashing down around them? Maya saw it. The flicker in Hart's expression. The way his breath came just a little too sharp. He knew, even if he wouldn't say it yet, he knew that the situation had shifted beyond his reach. Andre let the silence stretch just long enough to make them feel it. Then he stepped forward, smooth, deliberate, a man who had already won the game, but was gracious enough to let his opponent realize it at his own pace. There are two ways this plays out, Andre said, his voice deceptively casual, as if he were discussing a simple business deal instead of the impending collapse of their careers. 1. You uncuff my client, hand over everything you took from her, and we walk out of here like civilized people. 2. I file an emergency injunction with the federal court. And by this afternoon, you're the main subject of a Department of Justice investigation. He tilted his head slightly. How do you think that'll go for you, Sergeant? Hart exhaled sharply through his nose, his jaw locking so tight it looked like he might crack a tooth. His fingers twitched again, this time not from uncertainty, but from something darker, resentment, frustration, the slow-burning anger of a man realizing he was losing to someone he had assumed was beneath him. You think you can just walk in here and start making demands? Hart bit out, his voice just shy of shaking. Andre smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. I don't think, he said, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping into something lower, something sharper, I know. A heavy pause. Then Hart's nostrils flared, his knuckles turning white around the edges of the folder. Maya watched as he weighed his options, as he reached for some kind of leverage, some way to salvage his pride. But there wasn't one. And he knew it. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the room as Hart finally reached for his key, his movements stiff, reluctant. He turned toward Maya, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp with something that wasn't quite defeat. Turn around, he said through clenched teeth. Maya didn't move. Didn't even blink. Oh, she said, her voice laced with something just shy of amusement. I think you can manage. A flicker of something crossed Hart's face, rage, humiliation, maybe both, but he swallowed it down. Slowly, he stepped forward, unlocked the cuffs with a sharp click. The second the metal fell away from her wrists, Maya rolled her shoulders, stretching out the stiffness, but never breaking eye contact with Hart. There was no gloating, no unnecessary words, just a quiet, undeniable certainty. Hart had lost. And she wanted him to sit with that. Andre cleared his throat, his smile razor sharp. Now, he said, straightening his jacket, my client's belongings. All of them. Reed hesitated, but a sharp glance from Andre had him moving, retrieving the plastic bin containing Maya's phone, her briefcase, her folder. He placed it on the desk with forced nonchalance, but Maya saw the way his fingers flexed, the way his throat bobbed with an uncomfortable swallow. She reached forward, retrieving her things with a slow, deliberate ease, her phone, her briefcase, and then, finally, the folder. She smoothed her palm over it, feeling the weight of the pages beneath her fingertips, knowing exactly what they contained, knowing exactly why men like Hart had tried to keep them out of the courtroom. When she looked back up, Hart was watching her, his expression unreadable. This isn't over, he said, his voice low, rough. Maya smiled. Not big, not dramatic, just enough. Oh, she said, meeting his gaze with something cold, something unshakable. I know. Then she turned, her heels clicking against the tile in a steady, unwavering rhythm, and walked out of the precinct without another word. But Hart and Reed, they were the ones who felt trapped. The Daniels Federal Courthouse was packed. The kind of packed that meant people smelled something big on the horizon, something worth watching, something that had the potential to become more than just another case buried beneath bureaucracy and backroom deals. The gallery was full, reporters lining the aisles, attorneys exchanging whispers, court clerks moving with a nervous energy that suggested they already knew what was about to unfold. The air held that rare, electric tension, the kind that came before something irreversible. Maya walked through the heavy doors with the same controlled precision she had walked out of the precinct with. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just a slow, deliberate stride that told the room she belonged exactly where she was. She wasn't a defendant. She wasn't a victim. She was something else entirely. She was the storm. At the front of the room, Judge Meredith Cole sat poised behind the bench, her sharp eyes sweeping over the room, taking in the unusually high number of spectators, the quiet urgency buzzing just beneath the surface. She had been on the bench long enough to know when something was more than just another hearing. This wasn't routine. This was the beginning of something bigger. Andre was already there, standing at the plaintiff's table, flipping through notes with the easy confidence of a man who had already prepared for every possible outcome. He didn't look up when Maya took her seat beside him. He didn't need to. Across from them, in the defendants' seats, Hart and Reed sat rigid, their backs stiff, their faces carefully composed in that particular way men in uniform adopted when they realized, for the first time, that the system wasn't bending in their favor. Hart's hands were clasped together on the table, his jaw locked so tightly it looked like it might shatter. Reed kept shifting, his fingers tapping against his knee in short, erratic movements, his gaze flicking toward the gallery, toward the cameras, toward the reporters whispering to each other behind their hands. They had spent their entire careers walking into courtrooms as the accusers. Today they were the accused. Judge Cole glanced at the case files in front of her before looking up, her expression unreadable. "Let's proceed." Andre stood, buttoning his suit jacket with an unhurried grace, then turned to Maya. "Miss Bennett, can you state your full name and professional background for the record?" Maya folded her hands in her lap, her posture steady, her voice smooth when she spoke. "Maya Elise Bennett, former CIA field operative, current federal security consultant specializing in classified intelligence and anti-corruption investigations." The murmurs in the gallery swelled like a rising tide. A few reporters scrambled to scribble notes faster. Hart's fingers twitched. Andre nodded, his tone casual, but there was an unmistakable sharpness in his eyes. "And could you explain why you were unlawfully detained yesterday morning outside this courthouse?" Maya exhaled slowly, tilting her head slightly. "Because Sergeant Hart and Officer Reed fabricated a reason to stop me, illegally confiscated classified federal documents, and attempted to obstruct an ongoing corruption investigation." The murmurs became a wave. Judge Cole lifted a hand, and the room quieted, but the energy had already shifted. People were paying attention now. Andre turned his gaze toward Hart and Reed, letting the silence stretch, letting them feel it. "Let's clarify," he said. "You're saying that the officers knowingly detained you under false charges, and in doing so, interfered with a federal case." Maya's eyes locked onto Hart's. "That's exactly what I'm saying." Across the room, Reed shifted again, but Hart forced himself to stay still, his jaw clenched so tight the veins in his neck stood out. His pride wouldn't let him break first. Andre moved to the evidence table, picking up a small remote. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence a recording from the precinct, captured just outside the holding cell where Miss Bennett was detained." Judge Cole gave a short nod. "Proceed." Andre pressed a button, and suddenly, the voices of Hart and Reed filled the room, projected through the courtroom speakers, crisp and damning. "She had the documents on her. Doesn't matter. We say she tried to pass them off as real clearance files. But what if they are real? Then we say she stole them. Fraud. Impersonating a federal officer. No one's going to ask questions. She's a nobody, Reed. The judge will believe us. They always do." The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that came from a lack of words, but the kind of silence that came when everyone in the room understood they had just heard something irreversible. Reed swallowed hard. Hart's jaw twitched. Judge Cole leaned forward slightly. "Sergeant Hart," she said, her voice calm but laced with something dangerous. "Do you have an explanation for this?" Hart didn't speak. Didn't move. Reed finally cracked. "We were just doing our job," he blurted, his voice strained, desperate. Maya smiled then. "Just a small thing. Just enough." Andre shook his head. "Your job," he echoed, his tone razor sharp. "Your job is to uphold the law, Officer Reed. Not fabricate evidence. Not obstruct federal investigations. Not abuse your power for personal gain." Reed looked down at the table, his hands curling into fists. Hart stayed still, but Maya could see it, the slow unraveling, the realization creeping in. They had lost. Judge Cole tapped her gavel once. "Given the evidence presented," she said, "I find sufficient cause to escalate this matter to a full investigation by the Department of Justice. Effective immediately, Sergeant Vincent Hart and Officer Lucas Reed are suspended without pay, pending criminal charges." And just like that, the last illusion of control slipped from their grasp. Reporters were already moving, hands flying over keyboards, whispers turning into quiet chaos. Hart exhaled sharply, his shoulders rising and falling. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. Maya didn't bother to look at him when she responded. "Oh," she said, gathering her papers with practiced ease, "it is for you." And then she stood, turned, and walked out of the courtroom. For her, this wasn't just about winning. This was about making sure men like them never played this game again. The steps of the Daniels Federal Courthouse felt solid beneath Maya's heels, the weight of victory pressing into the ground with each deliberate step. The moment she pushed through the heavy doors, the crisp autumn air hit her like a reminder. Cool, sharp, fresh. The world outside hadn't changed. Chicago kept moving, kept pushing forward, as if nothing inside that courtroom had happened. But Maya knew better. Things had shifted. Lines had been drawn. And two men who once believed they were untouchable had just learned that even the system they relied on had its limits. The press was waiting. A cluster of reporters stood gathered near the courthouse steps, microphones ready, cameras rolling, eyes sharp with hunger. They had smelled the blood in the water the moment the hearing started, and now they wanted the full story, the official statement, the final nail in the coffin of two disgraced officers who had overplayed their hand. Andre stepped beside her, his posture relaxed but his presence unwavering. He adjusted his cuffs, exhaling slowly. "You ready for this?" Maya didn't hesitate. "I was born ready." As if on cue, a reporter, a woman with dark-rimmed glasses and a press badge clipped to her lapel, stepped forward. "Miss Bennett, do you have a comment on today's hearing?" Maya glanced past her, seeing the full weight of the moment. The cameras, the headlines already being written, the ripple effect that would reach beyond this courthouse, beyond these officers, into the very structure of power that had protected them for so long. She turned back to the reporter, her voice steady, unwavering. "Today was a reminder," she said, each word precise, intentional. "A reminder that no one, no matter their title, no matter their uniform, is above accountability. The officers who detained me thought they could manipulate the truth, twist the law to fit their own agenda. They were wrong." The woman scribbled notes furiously. Another reporter cut in. "Do you believe this case will set a precedent for law enforcement accountability?" Maya's lips pressed together, considering her words. A single case doesn't fix a broken system, she admitted, her gaze scanning the sea of faces before her. But it does expose the cracks. And once those cracks are visible, people start asking questions. They start demanding better. Andre nodded slightly beside her, as if approving the answer, but he remained quiet, letting Maya own this moment. Another reporter stepped forward. "What about Sergeant Hart and Officer Reed? Do you believe they'll face criminal charges?" Maya didn't even blink. "They will," she said simply, but there was a certainty in her voice that left no room for doubt. "And if they don't, we'll make sure they do." The reporters exchanged quick glances, the weight of that promise sinking in. A few more questions followed, but Maya knew when to end a conversation. She offered a final glance, a parting statement sharp enough to make it into every news segment. "This was never just about me," she said. "This was about every person who's been silenced, every person who's been told their truth doesn't matter. That changes now." And with that, she turned and walked away. The press lingered, their voices still rising, but Maya had given them enough. As she reached the edge of the courthouse steps, Andre matched her stride. "You handled that well," he said. She smirked. "You sound surprised." "I'm never surprised by you," he admitted. "But you do know this isn't over, right?" Maya inhaled deeply, glancing back at the towering courthouse, at the reporters still buzzing, at the weight of what had just happened. "Nothing's ever over," she said. "But for the first time in a long time, the right people are afraid." Andre's grin was slow, deliberate. That's the best kind of progress. As they reached the sidewalk, Maya felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A new message. Unknown number. She clicked it open. "This won't be the last time we cross paths. Watch your back." For a brief second, she just stared at the words, at the threat wrapped in false subtlety. Then, slowly, she smiled. Because the people who lost today, they were just now realizing they had picked the wrong woman to come after. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.